Alright guys, welcome to another video. Today we're going to talk about why kingdoms fail. So specifically, we're going to go over what every one of the kingdoms that fall apart, what do they have in common? And they do have one thing in common. Also, just some signs you can look for as far as leadership and the culture, or even the purpose of the kingdom, like what it's about. If it's not about the right thing, the chances of that kingdom succeeding is going to be very low, and there's some very obvious tells for that. Another one we're going to talk about is when kingdoms are the most vulnerable in the early, mid, and late game. There are specific milestones that you have to be able to cross. If you can't cross those milestones or these checkpoints, the kingdom is at risk for falling apart. And then finally, we're going to talk about some stuff that you can do as far as picking the right kingdom if you are migrating, but also if you are part of a kingdom, how you can contribute to help it flourish and succeed. All right, so let's actually get started. First, when do kingdoms fall apart? My definition of this is going to be a psychological threshold. It's not when one leader or a group of leadership retires. It's not when a whale or a group of whales leave, or even when you lose one KVK or a string of KVKs. Okay, it's actually when the collective no longer buys into the future of the kingdom. When enough people don't see a vision or a future for the kingdom, that kingdom falls apart. If the collective vision or the buy-in for the future is still there, even if you've lost a few KVKs in a row, that kingdom could actually still rebuild, bring in migrants, and lots of times even flourish more. But when you no longer have that collective buy-in, the kingdom is over. Okay, so let's actually start with leadership. So I really like this quote, so let's just read it out loud. So great leaders don't set out to be a leader. They set out to make a difference, and it's never about the role, always about the goal. So very often, not always the case, but very often, the strongest player, right, the biggest spender in your kingdom isn't necessarily going to be the best leader. A lot of them, wherever they got the money from, whether it's success, personal success, or, they just have a lot of money. A lot of them either don't have the time or don't really have the leadership skills to lead a kingdom. Now, this is a bigger problem in the early game, because in the early game, a big whale can have as much power as the rest of the kingdom. I remember in my kingdom, I was in 2844 when I started out, there was a whale that before KVK1, his power equal the rest of the kingdom combined for at least like the first 2 or 3 months. Right now, he was a really cool and chill guy, right? But if he wanted to take over the kingdom and do whatever he wanted, there's nothing that anyone else in that kingdom could have done at the time. All right, so what makes a good leader, though, isn't someone who's doing it for their personal gain. Of anything, being a leader or being in leadership in Rise of Kingdoms is a thankless job. The amount of work and bullshit you have to put up with and deal with to not get paid is something that I think it takes a special mindset to actually take on that responsibility. Right? So a good leader, one, can project a vision that other people buy into. They are responsible for the direction and success of the kingdom. They take on that responsibility. And then from the little things like communicating to the group what the goal is, what the standard is, to setting a standard and then enforcing it, to organizing like events to make sure the players in the kingdom can easily access different events in an organized way. Like these things all matter, right? And I don't think one person or a small group, even if they could do it successfully for a short amount of time, they can't do it for a long time. There's a high likelihood for burnout, and it's very important if you're looking at leadership or if you are part of leadership to always bringing in new, younger, hungrier players that haven't been burnt out yet. And this will actually keep the leadership dynamic fresh, but also it's very often that at some point the leader of a kingdom is going to retire or maybe even migrate out, and there's like a system set up for succession, right? So if you're bringing in new players to leadership often, those are also candidates for the next generation of leadership. And it's very, very important for, I think, a leadership to, one, have a big enough team to avoid burnout, but two, also always bringing in new people and having people that are logically going to step up to take over leading the kingdom if the current leadership steps down. And that's very, very important. Okay. The next is a culture. So in 2268, we had the Baboon Squad. Just a bunch of nonsense, but it does actually add to the community and the closeness of it. Another component that really helps build a strong culture is time, right? Because with time, you could go through adversity, you go through the up and downs. You have time to recycle out players that don't fit and bring in players that fit. A recent case I can think about the top of my head, so like 2605 is a kingdom that Chisgul is in, and a lot of people in Rise of Kingdoms know. And I'm not sure exactly how long 2605, as far as that leadership group, was there for, but I want to say it was less than a year. And I think one of the reasons why it didn't end up succeeding was they just didn't have enough time, right? It takes time to build a culture. And if leadership there didn't feel like sticking it out and dealing with the ups and downs, the adversity, and all the stuff that it takes to grow a culture, it's very, very hard to stabilize a kingdom in like 1 or 2 KVKs, right? Another one is adversity. So I would be very wary of a kingdom that's never lost before, because you just don't know how they're going to respond after they lose, right? So 1960 is like at least as far as for most players in Rise of Kingdom, recognized as the best kingdom in the game before this latest loss, right? And they've never lost a KVK before. So it'll be really interesting to see how they respond, recover, and rebound. I'm rooting for them to actually rebound and come back strong, because it's important for the game to have strong kingdoms, but we don't know how they're going to respond to adversity, right? They never lost before. Another one is a community. So if your kingdom doesn't have a Discord, that's a huge red flag. And they have a Discord that's not very active, I think that's also a red flag that the community or the culture isn't very strong. All right. So besides communicating in game, I think having a strong Discord community is very important. Accountability, in this case, people doing events that they sign up for. People like, for example, an event like a Alliance mobilization, right? Setting a minimum requirement, holding people accountable. In KVK, holding KP, DEDs, or whatever the kingdom requirement is. One, it's important to communicate that clearly, but two, to actually set standards and then enforce it. That's very important. Steve Jobs has a quote I like a lot. A players want to play with A players, right? If you don't set high standards and hold them accountable, why would top players actually want to be part of your kingdom, right? The other one is the organization, right? I talked about this earlier. Do you have someone in charge of events? Are they communicated clearly? Are the expectations communicated clearly, right? If you have MGE and they're set or fixed, what are they fixed based on? Like, do people actually agree or understand the reasoning why it's fixed, right? It should make logical sense where anyone who is actually performance oriented or growth oriented could buy into it, right? There's always going to be complainers, right? So you don't set up something to avoid people complaining. You set up something because the people that matter, the people that can actually contribute or are an asset to the kingdom can buy into why you're setting that up. And then finally, migration is very important. Every time you get migrants, right, it's going to cause some instability or disruption to the current culture of the kingdom. And the goal when you're migrating is, one, you want to be stronger, right? You want to be able to fight better, but also the migration you're bringing in should also help grow and strengthen the culture of the kingdom. So for me, it was very important that 2268 was doing voice interviews. I think that should be a baseline for any kingdom bringing in migrations, because if you don't talk to the person beforehand and find out what they're about, how do you really even know they're a good fit, right? Just looking at power, their equipment, their armaments, stuff like that, you could get a feel of how good they would be on the field, but you have no idea what they actually are like as a person, right? And usually when a person migrates, there's a variety of reasons. Some could be good, some could be not good. I think it's very important to find that out. And migration, and then taking in not just high power players, but good people that are fit for the kingdom is very important. And then finally, When I talk about purpose here, it's like, what is the purpose of your kingdom going to be about, right? Because, for example, a while ago, there was this kraken named Mephisto, uh, just caused drama in every kingdom he was in, and you know, he sometimes he'll talk a good game. Hey, I just want people to do well, whatever. But like, people that are assets to a kingdom don't cause drama everywhere they go, right? So a lot of people actually ended up following him to whichever kingdom they went because they wanted the gold chest, right? They wanted to be part of the notoriety. If that is the kind of people you're attracting, and that is the main attraction of your kingdom, how well or how stable do you think it's going to be? And again, in that kingdom, I think fell apart in KVK 3, right? But like, if your kingdom has never lost before, where you have a lot of stars and people are star chasers, where, you know, in this case I call them like gold diggers, where they're here for the wins and the rewards, they're not going to really set you up for success, right? So for me personally, I think it should be a combination of, one, people that want to have fun, but also taking on challenges and like growing together. And for me, that's personally what I enjoy the most, right? Like, being part of a kingdom that's not necessarily at the top, but you're helping that kingdom grow, develop, and then work their way up. And if you are a kingdom at the top, then you have to start finding new ways to challenge yourself to make things novel or interesting, right? Because whenever something is new, it's going to be interesting, fun, novel. And then when the novelty wears out, it is actually up to the leadership, but also people in the kingdom, to start finding new, novel ways to take on a fun challenge. So that's very important. So when are the kingdoms most vulnerable? So in the early game, kingdoms are vulnerable when, one, you have jumpers, right? So jumper groups are people that kind of, I guess, they communicate on Discord or decide together they're gonna start a new account or migrate accounts back to a new kingdom and start a new kingdom or a new project together. A lot of times the jumper groups are just players that kind of cut in the end game, not all the time, but a lot of times, or players that really have no business being leaders, that because they know more than the brand new native players, right? They take on the leadership role, they know what they're doing more than the native players, but the leadership structure just isn't very sound and it falls apart, right? Another challenge for early game is before the kingdom is stabilized, where if you don't have a jumper group, there's usually going to be civil war, right? If the civil war doesn't get resolved quickly, where you have like a clear clear group or alliance that's a leader for the kingdom, your kingdom is going to get wrecked in KVK 1. So if your kingdom is still unsettled or still kind of in civil war going to KVK 1, it's probably time to get out of there. Or if you just happen to be in a kingdom that has no leadership, right? So it's just all native players, you didn't actually get a jumper group or experienced players, and there's lack of clear leadership, I would actually suggest migrating out too, unless you want to try to take that on. But if you're a native player, you're still learning the game, and I don't think leadership should be something for native players that are still learning the game. And then finally, this doesn't actually necessarily happen in the early game, I talked about this earlier, but whenever you take your first loss, that's very, very important, because after your first loss, right, where, okay, now you're not this undefeated kingdom anymore, the way the kingdom responds is very important. So a lot of times after a first loss, the kingdom falls apart, the culture isn't very strong. Or if you're a kingdom like 1960 that you made it all like years in without losing, taking that first loss, it's going to be very interesting to see how they respond. But a lot of times in the early game, after that first loss, the kingdom will fall apart. In the mid game, I think where it's the most dangerous is actually KVK 5. So the way the game is currently set up, right, KVK 1, 2, and 3, that's pre-Season of Conquest, so there's no crystal tech. Now you could get endgame commanders in KVK 3, but the real endgame format where you get to do everything all the other endgame players are doing is in KVK 4. But in KVK 4, if you're a new kingdom, you're still fighting other kingdoms in your continent. So for the most part, you still know the kingdoms you're fighting in, and they're still within your power level. After KVK 4, now you could play any kingdom, right? So if you were a quote-unquote Imperium, and your power level was high enough to be an Imperium, going into KVK 5, usually those kingdoms are going to get destroyed by like actual Imperium kingdoms, just because they have older, more experienced players and just a lot more established systems in general. So it's very, very common, and I notice this for a lot of kingdoms in my continent. Right around KVK 5, like either during or after, a kingdom falls apart. And sometimes it's not very noticeable until KVK 6, but that's actually a very real danger area for a lot of kingdoms. So if your kingdom is heading into KVK 5, or just finished KVK 5, you actually want to be on a heightened lookout. If a kingdom can make it past KVK 5 or KVK 6 without falling apart, that's a very, very good sign. Okay. And then finally, in the late game, a couple of reasons. One, just this Imperium designation. So if a kingdom gets too far past the Imperium threshold where they can't drop being Imperium, they're very much at risk of falling apart, because when you're in Imperium status and you can't drop it, there's a very limited amount of migrants you could bring in. And then usually for kingdoms like that, they also have a lot of older players that are retiring and then just essentially become dead weights in the kingdom, right? So when you have the combination of not being able to bring in new migrants and players retiring and you can't drop Imperium, that's a very, very dangerous sign for a kingdom. So like 1254 is a race of kingdom, I think, that falls under that category. They also just couldn't get a fight, right? They couldn't get a match because they were just too big and strong. And a lot of players just started like losing. They just lost morale and lost hope over time. Another one is what I'll call the quote unquote super teams, right? So in the NBA, it's very common because, starters is just 5 players. They're just bringing in these star players. So the 2012, 2013 Lakers are a good example. On the screen, all 5 of those players were all stars, were, besides maybe Ron Artest, number 15 on the left, they were all stars of very high level, like MVP caliber players at one point. A lot of them were still in their prime, were near their prime when they formed the super team. They ended up with a record that was barely better than 500, and they got blown out in the first round, right? Because when you incorporate a lot of new high power players, there's still like the chemistry and the culture that you need to build. And a lot of times when that happens, I notice that in the end game or late game, right, a kingdom will migrate in a whole alliance or bring in a lot of high power players. And maybe they'll do well in one KVK after, or maybe they don't do well, but shortly after that, the kingdom collapses, right? I think a good example for that recently is 1034. So 1034 was one of the best kingdoms when I was first starting, and probably for the first year or so. And I forgot who they brought in, but they brought in another alliance. I migrated for someone from, oh man, I don't remember, but and they did really, really well in the KVK after, and then like 1 or 2 KVKs later, now their top players migrated out, and for the most part, 1034 is no longer one of the top kingdoms in this game. And then finally, it's just for these end game or late game big kingdoms, a lot of the player base just talks about retirement, where the leadership talks about retirement. And then when one player goes, especially in leadership, and it triggers like a cascading effect where a lot of other players just retire, where they migrate out, and the kingdom's over. Which is why I think it's very important to not only bring in new migrants all the time, right? You have to be out of Imperium to do that, but also you're mixing in, bringing in older players with younger players with very promising accounts to actually keep that fire and that drive going. So even as the older players, I think maybe kind of like burn out, worn out from the game, retire, you still have enough of that fire and passion and newness from the younger players to sustain the kingdom. Okay, and then finally, what can you do? Right, I talked about this in a migration video, but you want to always be accumulating passwords. Even if you love the kingdom, you think it's in a good place, it's just good to always be accumulating passports. If you're purchasing once a month, you at least want to buy the $5 bundle. But if you buy the $10 bundle, the 5 and the 10, you could get 3 passports a month. You could slowly build up passports that way. Or also, like in your kingdom, if there is an opportunity to just buy passports with alliance credits or even with resources, you should definitely do that. The second is make sure you want to, when you do migrate, where you are in a kingdom where they are bringing migrants, these migrants or your migration is for the right reason. If you're chasing gold chest, right, you're a gold digger, you just want to go to a kingdom with a lot of whales, you're going to a kingdom because you're following a content creator, uh, it's probably not for the right reason, right? Because if that content creator leaves, the reason for you migrating is gone. If you're there for the gold chest, um, it it's not going to actually be very, very. It's not how do I just how do I want to word this? It's just not there for the right reason, right? Essentially, you want to surround yourself with assets, not less liabilities. So what I mean by that, like every player that comes in, if you wanted to label them, hey, is this person actually a net positive, or do they actually feel like a net drain or a liability? You could label that. And the more players you in the kingdom that you bring in, that you're surrounding yourself with, that you think is a net positive, the stronger that culture is going to be, the less likely the leadership's going to get burnt out. When leadership does want to implement a new direction or new things to focus on, it's a lot easier to make that change. And just because A players want to play with A players, okay. So for you, you could help with being part of leadership. If you don't want to be part of leadership, at least make sure you're helping contribute to the culture. And contributing to the culture means taking care of your shit first, right? Being able to meet the standards and participating when you should be, showing up on time, being responsible for the stuff that you should be doing. And then when you don't do it, taking responsibility for that too. Not causing drama and complaining about little things, understanding the big picture, seeing it from other people's perspective. Those are all things that you can do to help out the kingdom. So if you watch all the way to the end, hopefully you got some value from this, or at least found this interesting. If you haven't yet, please like the video. Also, if you subscribe, it'll really help out. And I'll talk to you guys next time.